This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. Hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate podcast. My name is Seamus Murphy and today I'm joined by consultant Robert Ramsay. How's it going, Robert?
Yeah, very well, Seamus. How's things at your end?
Not too bad. We've had two podcasts now on looking at carbon markets, and we've kind of looked at, I suppose, the first one, the what are they, a bit of a description into how it all works. And then in the last podcast with John, we spoke about why are carbon markets becoming such an important part of land management in the UK and around the world. What are your thoughts on the couple of conversations we've had?
Yes, I really enjoyed talking to Ben and to John. Interesting. They're all over this stuff, and really I'm coming from the farmer end, the consultancy end as well, and looking at it and still looking at it with, a bit of skepticism and a bit of, a bit wary of the whole carbon market world still. There's so much to learn, so much happening, and certainly there's great opportunities for farmers here, but there's also be wary and take good advice, I think was the key points from both those discussions.
Yeah. And within all that, everything that we've been talking about, none of it is happening in isolation of everything else that's happening and all the kind of other moves, particularly in terms of policy and the national test program and those kind of things that are all getting the likes of carbon footprinting into everybody's kind of conversations at the moment. And to speak a bit more about all of that with us today, we have a consultant from the Air Office, Alex Pirie. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Hi, folks. Excited to be on. For my take, anyway, will be that the last couple of years has seen a tremendous acceleration in green policy for Scotland. We know that climate change is a big issue that the Scottish Government want to get to grips with. We're coming off the back of COP26, which was, I think, a bit of a mixed conference. There were some great successes, and there were some things that we maybe fell short on. But we're going to talk about carbon auditing today. I think that we've come leaps and bounds from where we have been, and it's just maintaining that momentum and continuing kind of small incremental changes that are going to benefit your business. And then there's the biodiversity story to build into that as well, and putting everything in this broader context.
Yeah, so it's interesting at the moment that policy, so that it's the development of policy that's really getting really rapid. There's a lot of stuff coming out, but we are still, I think, stuck in the old system. We've still got, for farmers, we're still in a basic payment driven, subsidy to keep us where we are. We're almost in a state of flux at the moment, so that there's all this really good, exciting stuff coming, pro-farming stuff coming, but we're in this point where it's not, the funding mechanism isn't quite there yet, and we do have that next couple of years really where we're going to see that new model evolving, and certainly there is still scope to lobby and to have your say in some of the direction of that as well.
Yeah, and I think we're everything that we've spoken about in the previous podcast in terms of carbon markets, it's all optional stuff. Really, it's stuff that could be a nice additional income to some farmers if they're lucky enough to have the ability to, say, plant trees, restore peatland, these kind of things. Whereas the policy element to it is for a lot of farmers to get that basic payment and survive kind of and continue farming. It's something that is going to become a mandatory thing, moving towards carbon management becoming an everyday kind of aspect of agriculture in Scotland.
And I think that was kind of the aspiration of the Farm Advisory Service and the availability of carbon auditing support, that farmers would pick up carbon auditing and over time would develop that kind of familiarity with carbon auditing, and we would see these changes on a recurring basis with them.
I find it quite exciting, Alec. Your list of carbon audits will be the same length as my list of carbon audits. There's so many people now keen to get on board, and I think there's a real message to our consumer, to consumers, to the general public, to say, look, farmers actually, although we're often portrayed as the problem, and we are part of the problem, but although we're often held up in the media as being the big problem, actually most farmers are really engaged in this and looking to make changes and do things to actually A, make them more money, and B, and most importantly, do their bit for climate change and biodiversity.
Well, do you know, it's really interesting that you say that, Robert. I know this is a little while ago now, but I was at a conference back in December last year, and we were talking climate change, we were talking biodiversity and landscape change. And one of the initial questions that I asked the group was, how many of you have had a carbon audit done? And, just about everybody in the room put their hand up, which was great. But my follow-up question was, and how many of you had a second one done? And the reality is that, there weren't an awful lot of hands went up there. Farmers have taken the first step. But I think it's important that, they're keen to move on and to take action, but we need a kind of clear pathway for them.
And on the kind of the carbon audit side of things, how do farmers feel about being asked to do the carbon footprint, and then even the in terms of the wider carbon markets discussion? What's the general feeling amongst farmers?
So I think that falls into a couple of camps, Seamus. There's probably the older generation where there's maybe no successor, that business is probably time limited anyway. They're looking at it thinking, why do we have to do this? What's the point? What are we trying to achieve? I have to say that group probably isn't that big. And then the other group, I think I certainly feel a big difference in the last 12 months of people going from worrying that they're going to be told that they're going to have to do a carbon audit to actually hearing that a carbon audit is quite a useful tool to manage their business, and keen to do one, and even keen to pay for one. So there is that change. And I think those guys, the more carrot focused we can be, that we can show people that if we do a carbon audit, the actual auditing process is painless for the farmer. It's not the most glamorous part of our job, but it gives us a great insight into the rest of the business. And then we can look at mitigation measures and look at business options to actually make big improvements. And I think that most guys are now in tune with that and fairly keen to have a go. There's always going to be people who don't engage and aren't interested, but I think we're dealing with the majority who are pretty interested in this.
Do you think there's a degree of pragmatism coming in there, just that people are realizing that we just need to get on with it now, we just need to get these things done?
I think that it's interesting that I had a conversation with Ben Law a number of weeks ago now, and we were talking about the normalization of woodland within the farmed environment. I do think that we're getting to the point where we have achieved the normalization of carbon auditing within the farm business assessment process, if you like. I take Robert's point. I agree with him that there will be a subsect of farmers out there who are still resistant to carbon auditing. But there are a handful of tools out there now, and I understand that in itself will give people some hesitance. What tool am I meant to be using to calculate my carbon? But, if you've taken the first step, and you're being consistent with the tool that you're using and that you're seeing results, I don't doubt that you're moving in the right direction.
And you said, Alex, there that you were at that meeting and a lot of farmers had done their first carbon audit, but they hadn't gotten that far to their second. I know from some projects that I've been involved in that the real value I feel in the carbon audit is when you have a long 5, 10, 20 years of carbon audits done, and that's when you can kind of look back and tell a story about your business. Do you think that that kind of approach to it, to say it can be used almost as a marketing tool as well as a business management tool. Do you think that that's getting through to farmers now as well?
Absolutely, and I think farmers love to benchmark, but the most important person to benchmark against is yourself. At the end of the day, you need to do what's in the best interest of your business, and if that's small incremental changes over time, that's perfect by my book.
Yeah.
It's also quite exciting that the funding mechanism for carbon audits has changed as well. So we now have preparing for sustainable farming, and that gives us probably a leaner model for actually presenting the data back to the farmer. So what we have been using is quite an in-depth report, and a lot of that depth isn't actually required. Now the new proposal, the new system that's there for preparing for sustainable farming will give us a nice, lean, to the point list of mitigation measures for farmers, and that's really the bit that we can add value to on farm. I don't want to sit and write a long report telling a farmer what they already know. I want to get on farm, sit at the kitchen table and say, right, we've done your audit. Here are the top 3 things you should be doing. So I think there's a nice change happening in the mechanics of how a carbon audit is funded and what we've got to do, that is now moving to a very proactive, positive experience for the farmer.
And do you think that all of this kind of interest, and as more people become familiar with carbon footprinting and become more comfortable with phrases and words surrounding carbon and greenhouse gases and these kind of things, do you think that might increase the interest then in this other aspect of it, where we're talking about this kind of private carbon market area?
Yeah, I think, for a long time, the carbon story was kind of locked away, and it was a kind of exclusive club, if you like. The kind of proliferation of carbon auditing in the last couple of years has really opened up the discussion with farmers. And there are farmers who are now prepared to talk about things like their enteric fermentation. And there are farmers who are prepared to talk about their carbon sequestration. And, we've heard an awful lot about peatland restoration in the last wee while. Regenerative agriculture has found a new lease of life in the conversation, and I do think farmers across Scotland are prepared to do their bit. It's just finding out something that fits in with their business model right now.
The sequestration story is interesting as well, Alec, isn't it?
Yep.
We know what we're developing. Certainly the tool we use, AgriCalc, is built around sound science, and the sound science for sequestration has been, it's very complex, very difficult, and AgriCalc now has a pretty good handle on soil sequestration, and but that it's always evolving, it's always developing, and I still think that's where it's really important that when we look at carbon markets, we don't get really complacent with one good carbon audit that we then go and sell all our sequestration options. We sell all our carbon credits down the river, and then we get a wet year or a different audit. The science changes, and then things aren't so good. So I think, just to reiterate the importance of having that continual process of annual or every few years doing a carbon audit, just to make sure we know where we still stand, where the thing, where the business sits just now, is so important.
And the soil carbon story, just to continue on that, Robert, I mean, a lot of farmers have been talking to us for many years about how we needed to include soil carbon and grassland carbon sequestration into the story. And that's a real success for farmers, and it's nice to be able to build that in. But I do think at the end of the day, it has to come back to what your gross emissions are, what your gross output is, and how do we move in a positive direction. I don't think, for the majority of farmers out there, that the carbon, the soil carbon sequestration is going to fundamentally change the story for them.
Yeah, it's quite right. And certainly for those productive businesses who are pushing hard, producing a lot of food, it's impossible to produce carbon-based foodstuff without an emission. And that's going back to the 3 legs in the stool. There are businesses out there that are going to have to emit, going to have to be contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, and there's other businesses that are well suited to do more of a sequestration job. So those three legs in the stool are food production, biodiversity, and climate change. And we need to have all three in mind, and we need to have all three in mind across the whole piece, and have a good understanding at a business level, but also have that kind of national understanding of what farming actually does. And of course, farming does far more than just those three legs, but they're the kind of three fundamentals.
It is interesting as well when as we spoke in the last podcast about the impact of the market and kind of retailers and how they will be looking down their supply chain towards agriculture. You could only think that it would be a major advantage for a farmer to have already carried out one or multiple carbon footprints before that retailer comes knocking, before that processor comes knocking. So then you have some sort of evidence to show that you've started on that kind of road to reduce emissions.
Insetting, to me, is the way forward. So offsetting is where we probably as farmers get frustrated when we talk about aviation buying agricultural land and planting trees and that they can offset their carbon. Insetting, for me, from a supply chain perspective, is so much more. There's much more to it, and that's where basically the emissions from the whole supply chain should be offset within the supply chain. So somebody in the supply chain should take the responsibility to deal with that. And again, that's where the land-based guys at the start of the food supply chain have got so much to give when it comes to sequestration options, and that's really with that in mind is why I'm so positive and excited about the future for agriculture in general, and particularly the red meat story. There's a really exciting whole industry developing there that is both heading towards carbon neutrality and also pro farming, which is, again, that's what I'm all about.
Well, one of the things that we have coming up, Robert, you and I are working on a meeting here in Ayrshire with the integration of cattle on a hill for the purposes of regeneration, carbon storage, but you're also getting that conservation grazing aspect of it as well. And I think, we can lose ourselves in the carbon story a bit. And there are businesses out there, particularly the extensive businesses, who maybe feel that, in comparison to an intensive dairy or an arable unit, that their carbon footprint is coming off comparatively poorly. The reality is that what they're doing in terms of ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation is just as valuable as the carbon story from your intensive guys.
Mm-hmm. And what's amazing with that meeting, so we're having that meeting in Renfrewshire, we're having one in Inverness and one in Lewis, which are basically looking at using technology to manage cattle better in the uplands. So particularly, it's basically about GPS collars, it's about virtual fencing, and the power of technology. I remember hearing somebody talking about climate change and basically having a real confidence that if the money's right, technology will fix it. And I think we can see that developing with the climate change story, but certainly with agriculture, you look at the issues for agriculture are mainly profitability, climate change targets, and biodiversity. And when we look at some of the technologies that are coming out, particularly for the uplands, they have a positive impact on your costs, so it reduces your costs. It has a positive impact on your grazing management in the uplands, so you can graze to an agreed conservation grazing plan, and you can have a positive impact on peatlands and on emissions and have better performing livestock. So it's amazing to see all these technologies coming on, and how big an impact they're going to have in a really pretty short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Technology will help us do that. I know that there's a lot of talk, particularly in peatland restoration projects, and kind of drone monitoring and these kind of things, using UAVs to to be able to effectively calculate whether the restoration has worked.
And again, just reiterating it, but the major issues globally, the top two major issues we've got are climate change and biodiversity loss. Land-based industries are the only ones that can actually do positive things in all these areas. Farmers have got such an important role to play going forward, and that is altering systems, but also acknowledging the systems that we've got are actually working pretty well in some cases, doing a good job. So I don't think anyone should be worried about what's coming in the future. There's plenty to be positive about.
It's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity for anyone involved in land-based industries.
And what hasn't been a challenge has been, claiming BPS has not been a difficult thing for land managers to do, and it's not done anything. It's not changed. There's been no transformational change in the industry. It's certainly in my career. It looks pretty much the same as it did before, and it's time that the thing gets a bit of a shake, gets a bit of a rocket, and we start to acknowledge the people who are doing a good job and start to help those who aren't doing such a good job, help them get the tools to get on the bus, get on the train, and come with us.
Well, that's a good point, because do you think that there is possibly like a lot of farmers who would be really, really keen to do stuff to help the environment or help biodiversity, sequester carbon on their farm, but either two things: don't have potentially the means, the funding, or another area that we haven't touched on really at all in this podcast is the actual training, the actual knowledge of what to do.
So with regards to the way that schemes and funding are looking, I do, obviously budgets are going to be tight going forward. We know that we're going through a lot of change right now. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the next couple of years funding is cut or becomes more targeted. What we're seeing right now, and this is just my opinion, is that the schemes that are in place right now could perform and could have impact on farms that, just because of a couple of barriers for whatever reason, they're unable to access that funding. Right now, and I'm sure Robert would agree, we could go out, Robert, and find 10 farms each in Ayrshire who would be interested to put in some hedges, let's say, for example. But current funding mechanisms would require them to undertake some additional practice that would be a challenge for their business. There are just some requirements to accessing that funding that make the whole process unviable for farmers. So I do think accessibility going forward is going to be a really big thing. It looks like outcomes-based environmental schemes are going to be the way forward for Scotland. And I do think that has huge potential to give farmers the flexibility to actually get out and do what they know will work on their ground, as opposed to, sticking to a very rigid kind of set of management requirements.
Mm-hmm. There's also a big argument at the moment for, we're in very interesting times where we've got massive inflation, things are changing, the public are under pressure, but what we need is a fair price for what we do, and probably some, potentially some conditions on that too. So if you look at where the aligned dairy world is at, so if you look at those that have got Tesco or Co-op contracts, Sainsbury's contracts, they've got quite a bit of stuff that they need to do, both, from a climate and a biodiversity point of view, and they do that in order to get a good price for what they do. So there's some of this is what the government should give to the farmer, and there's also some of this should be how does the government shape future food policy? Basically put the pressure on the supply chain, rather than having it coming from a legislation point of view, have it from an economic point of view. But that is a difficult discussion, and I do have I've got some mixed views on that. I think long term that's the way to go, but also in the short term it's very important that this transition period gets us on the journey to where we want to get to, but don't expect, perhaps like what we're seeing south of the border, is don't expect us to get there in 2 years' time.
I think I'd just echo something that Robert touched on there. I mean, obviously, nobody could have foreseen the Ukraine conflict that's going on right now, and that has really, in the past wee while, put a re-emphasis on supply chains. I think it's fair to say that a lot of agricultural policy in Scotland was being driven by climate change and biodiversity decline, and those are all good things. But the conflict now in Eastern Europe has really brought food and supply chains back to the forefront of people's minds, and I think that's actually a good thing. You know, we've talked an awful lot about achieving a balance as an industry, and having multiple things that are achievable at the same time. So I think that I'd much rather there wasn't this conflict in Eastern Europe, but what that has done is allowed us to reassess what's actually important to us as an industry.
I think you're right, Alex, and I think everything that has happened over the past year has highlighted to me is that climate change is not moving from the agenda. If the war in the Ukraine, inflation, all these things hasn't knocked it off, hasn't let it kind of slip from up high up the priority list, I don't think anything will, and that's something that maybe has helped to kind of bring it forward in the kind of consciousness or the level of importance to everybody, not just farmers, because some people may have been under the impression that, give it a few years and it'll die down and it'll go away and we won't have to worry about it anymore. But I think this has proven to everyone that although food security has moved up that agenda, it's right up there beside climate change. Climate change has not dropped in its importance to government and in terms of policy.
I totally agree with that, but I think the food security story is a massive change. You know, we won't be 2 years since we heard about the basic policy of, you know, let the people in the world with the big fields feed us and we'll deal with biodiversity. And you know, the Ukraine story, the, you know, global inflation story as well has really brought to light or reminded us, and just in time reminded us, that food production is fundamental to human life. You know, if we can't feed ourselves, we won't be here, and ultimately we'll have a much lower carbon footprint and we'll have much better biodiversity. But we don't want to see any of that. So we need, you know, farming now has a real proper sense of purpose, and I don't think any government would be looking to reduce food production now. You know, I think we've got a big demand or an increasing demand for food, and with that we need to be trying to have a sustainable approach to increasing food supplies as well.
So Robert, those kind of aligned contracts that you mentioned that are kind of already in place in dairy, there's growing interest from other areas of agriculture where actors up the supply chain are coming down and looking to engage with their kind of supply chain and trying to engage with farmers to get farmers to do carbon audits, do different kind of things on their farms to reduce emissions and these kind of things. Do you think there's a lot of concern amongst farmers about that, or is that a positive move, or what's your thinking there?
Is it a positive move? The intention is very positive. You know, what they're trying to do, they're trying to have a product that they can definitely market to their consumer as green, you know, low carbon, high welfare, good biodiversity story. It could be done better. You know, there are challenges in these areas, but it's fairly new. I mean, these contracts, they have, some of them been running for a good number of years, but the principle is fairly new, and there's lessons to be learned. You know, that there is the processor can probably be too hands-on in the production system and be a bit too demanding. But I think on the whole, a dairy processor looking at cost of production, looking at carbon, the carbon credentials of the business, and also the biodiversity piece, and rewarding the farmer for it. And that's the important bit, is this needs to be additional. This needs to be something that's better than the standard market price. So there's a reward for the farmer doing positive things and also pushing that story to the consumer. I don't think anyone can argue against that, but it has to be done in a sensitive manner, and it has to have a two-way conversation. It has to have feedback from the processor to the farmer, and also from the farmer to the processor, to make sure that where we're going is actually, I'm going to use the word sustainable, like what they're asking of the farmer isn't too much, but it is enough to drive a bit of change into the supply chain.
There is a bit of danger in some of these aligned contracts. I mean, I've been asked to complete biodiversity audits or soil audits or audits for the water environment. There is a bit of a danger that some farmers, I don't doubt, will see them as, you know, a box ticking exercise for a larger company to talk about their credentials in this area. My advice to a farmer in that regard would be, okay, you know, maybe it is that, maybe you're correct, but let's try and find one thing to take out of your audit that, you know, you maybe weren't aware of, something that you can build upon, something that's genuinely interesting to you, and let's see if we can develop that as an idea for your benefit, not for the benefit of your milk supplier or whoever this larger company happens to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that risk of box ticking is actually higher in the subsidy world. You know, I think if the department asks you to do something, I think there is often a tendency to try and find the easiest way to do it. And that's, you know, the whole industry's changing, and our mindsets have to change too. And we need to start moving towards a real steps forward, rather than just ticking a box to stay in the past.
The other thing, I suppose, just talking about these contracts and the engagement with the supply chain, that those building up those relationships, I suppose, from the farmer's point of view, that would be a positive thing, I suppose, as well, looking to the future. And if we go back to carbon markets, and we mentioned insetting, it's building those relationships to do further work in the future that could be lucrative. Another kind of positive that could be got from that approach.
Definitely, but it's all built around trust. All parties in the supply chain must trust each other and you know, feel like each person's got each other's back. You know, that's where we're at. If there's competition within the supply chain, it's destined to fail.
I really do love the trust. The trust thing you mentioned there, Robert. I do think that regardless of whether or not we're talking about biodiversity decline or climate change or carbon, you know, implementing ideas and practices at farm level, some of these will not have the effect that we're looking for them to have. You know, there will be times where businesses stumble. There will be ideas that don't work out, and farmers need to know that they're not going to be punished for that. That, you know, it's good that you have a go and that you've tried something different and that you've learned from that.
What do you think farmers should do now then? What should they go away after listening to these three podcasts? What should farmers go away and what's the first thing that they should do?
So I think certainly in these podcasts we've probably shown that it is a very complex world out there as far as carbon markets go. It's not to say don't get involved. You know, this is the time to work out where you are, do a carbon audit and find out where you are in this system and what opportunities are out there. Take good advice, speak to people, don't jump in with both feet. And if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But there are opportunities there. There's money in this, and it's certainly worth taking a look. If it fits your system and you know what you're getting into, I'm certainly not standing in anyone's way from getting involved.
Great.
I think, I echo everything that Robert's just said there. But for my money, number one, if you're not already looking at your carbon footprint and what your carbon story is on your farm, do get on the train. Keep farming. That's obviously really important. There's a lot of really great farmers out there doing an incredible job, and we need to be good as an industry at congratulating ourselves for a job well done sometimes. And on the nature conservation side of things, there are options out there if you're interested. I mean, the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme is open or continuing for the next 2 years. The Nature Restoration Fund is expected to come back in the autumn this year for another round of funding. These are two very different but very good sources of funding and investment for nature conservation on your farms. So there's a host of options out there, whether or not you want to talk about climate change or biodiversity conservation.
On top of that, Alec, I think we need to be shouting from the rooftops all that's good about farming. There's a lot of voices out there. There's a lot of unquestioned criticism of farming and animal welfare, climate change, biodiversity. We need to have a collective voice and show our consumer how exciting what we do is, how good the food we produce is, and also importantly from a succession point of view is how good a career we've got as well. How farming is here to stay and has a tremendous role to play in the future for the whole UK economy.
Thanks, Robert and Alex, and thank you for listening today. For more information on everything we talked about, please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website, and you will also find the 2 previous podcasts in the carbon management series. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.